Hey gang, Coach Tim here today. I hope you're doing great. Thanks for stopping by to check out the video. We want to talk a little bit about diet sodas today. Start off by talking about regular sodas, which fall under the umbrella of sugar sweetened beverages. I think most of us pretty much inherently know that they're bad news for our health, for our waistline. Pretty much any negative health outcome that you can think of could probably be tied back to overconsumption of sugar sweetened beverages, added sugars, things like overweight, obesity, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative conditions, stroke, you name it. You probably can make some kind of argument and tie it back to that, some stronger than others. So naturally, that has led many of us, which I would say we've been guided a lot of times by scientific researchers, by healthcare practitioners, and even authoritative health bodies to consume zero-calorie diet sodas that are sweetened with non-caloric, high-intensity artificial sweeteners. So, this makes sense in theory. It sounds potentially beneficial. They're could potentially reduce caloric intake, reduce sugar intake, and so on. So on paper, it sounds good. In practice, however, the research is starting to illuminate that they may be just as negative in terms of overall health in the long term as potentially sugar-sweetened beverages. Maybe even worse when you consider the dose. We're not really sure on that, but I just wanted to highlight some of the negative aspects that could come out of long-term diet soda consumption. And let's start with one of the stronger points, and that would be on glycemic control, metabolic function, and gut health. So you think, okay, no sugar, no calories, it shouldn't really have a negative effect in these areas, but actually there's pretty convincing research showing strong associations between diet soda consumption and type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome. Now, if you're not familiar with metabolic syndrome, it's a pretty nasty host of symptoms such as high fasting blood sugar, high blood pressure, excess abdominal obesity, and poor blood lipids. And that can pretty much, again, be tied to basically any non-communicable chronic disease that you can think of. So definitely not a good thing. And so I'm saying that the research is showing pretty strong associations here. For instance, one study showed that diet soda consumption was associated with a 37% increase in metabolic syndrome and a 67% increase in type 2 diabetes. I do want to point out that some of the research that I'm citing here is observational or associative in nature, in the sense that these are not showing cause and effect relationships, they're just showing associations. So it's important research, but we can't necessarily say based on this alone that it's causing these things. However, there's some pretty compelling arguments in this particular case why this might be so. For instance, studies show that artificial sweeteners can really drive us to seek out more sweet things, so it kind of creates a resistance to sweetness. So we compensate for more, to satisfy this need. So we overeat more sweet foods, drink more sweet beverages as a result. On top of that, we also have like a subconscious overcompensation. So we think that we've saved a certain amount of calories drinking diet sodas so that we eat more down the line. So those would be some potential explanations. Some more recent research is illuminating another area which is very fascinating. That would be on gut health. So researchers have found that even short-term consumption of artificial sweeteners can induce gut dysbiosis. So basically creating a bad environment, relatively speaking, of bad gut bacteria to good bacteria. And that is actually having a negative effect on glucose tolerance, so inducing glucose intolerance, which poor glycemic control. And then even on top of that, previous research has shown that artificial sweeteners can reduce insulin sensitivity or increase insulin resistance, and that effect may be even more pronounced in overweight or obese folks, which not always, but often are the folks who are grabbing diet drinks. So we have that, and then that leads into the next potential effect, and that's weight gain and obesity with diet sodas. So you can kind of see the writing on the wall there with some of these potential explanations, with overeating, overconsumption, poor glucose tolerance, insulin resistance, things like that. And even in some of those associative studies, we found that, or they highlighted the fact that diet soda consumption increases the risk for belly fat, excess abdominal fat. So that's another thing that would fall under this category here. The San Antonio Heart Study was one of the more influential studies in this area, and they found that over the course of 7 or 8 years, folks who drank more diet soda were at a greater risk for weight gain and obesity. Several review studies have followed up since that time, and several other observational studies, and followed in the same footsteps, basically showing an increase in weight gain, increase in abdominal obesity, increase in overall obesity. So pretty compelling evidence there. Now, one confounding factor is that if it's an associative study, how are we teasing out who's drinking diet sodas? So maybe is it the chicken or the egg? Are overweight, obese people drinking diet sodas because they're overweight and obese, or are they drinking it and that's leading to it? So I think that's another important point to point out. So I just want to be fair in saying that. But a recent randomized controlled trial did show that folks who follow the same reduced caloric diet, reduced calorie diet, drank water versus drinking diet soda, the folks who drank water lost more weight. So that's potentially, one. The diet soda group did lose weight, just not as much as the water group. But going back to our previous point about metabolic function, the diet soda group actually did not improve those metabolic parameters, blood glucose and insulin function, to the same extent as the water group. So that's important to note. The next area that's really important to talk about is the effects, diet soda and the effects on cardiovascular health and stroke. And so a very recent study published in the journal Stroke found that folks who consume diet soda were at a 3-fold greater risk for stroke and also for dementia, which we'll cover a little bit more in just a second. Now, this is a recent study, so it's grabbing headlines, but it's not the first of its kind. Several other studies, which I've cited in the article that you can check out through the link or check out below, have shown connections or associations between diet soda consumption and cardiovascular events, stroke, high blood pressure, coronary heart disease, and so on. And so this is really important information to consider, and especially if there's a link between type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome, that also feeds right into cardiovascular disease, because those are major risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Now, speaking of bringing back up the diabetes, that leads us into the next potential area where diet sodas can have an impact, and that's dementia or Alzheimer's disease, which is actually known as type 3 diabetes or referred to as type 3 diabetes because of similarities between it and type 2 diabetes and the brain's resistance to insulin and glucose intolerance. So certainly something to consider there. There's also cognitive function, potential issues with cognitive function, behavior, and mood with diet soda consumption. You have artificial sweeteners increasing oxidative stress. The brain is particularly susceptible to oxidative stress. So there's definitely some things to consider there. And artificials are also seeming to have neurological effects that can, like I said, affect behavior and mood. So one study showed that just 8 days of consuming an artificial sweetener led to irritable mood, feelings of depression, and poor performance on spatial tasks, which would be indicative of cognitive decline or some kind of cognitive function parameter there. In addition, another associative study found that diet soda consumption was associated with depression. Now there's neurological effects with artificial sweeteners. They may have an effect on neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, so there may be a link there. And those same neurological effects may also explain things like headaches and insomnia, if anyone's experiencing those things with diet sodas. Finally, cancer, which is a difficult topic to discuss, but it is relevant to the conversation. On one hand, you have an artificial sweetener like aspartame, which can be metabolized into formaldehyde, which is a known carcinogen. So there's some potential explanation there. And one study did find a 42% increase in the risk of leukemia in folks who drank diet soda. So there's quite a few things that could potentially be linked to diet soda. I just don't see a whole lot of benefits to regular consumption of artificial sweeteners or diet soda. So again, I'll be the first to admit that a lot of this data is associative. It's not necessarily showing cause and effect relationship. However, the research is really illuminating some negative things here, and at best it would be neutral, but it seems like in regular consumption these effects are more pronounced. So I just caution you to take that all into consideration. Check out the article that I wrote. It dives much deeper into each one of these issues with references. I'd love to hear your feedback, any questions that you have, any concerns that you have. It's an important topic for discussion, and I look forward to getting into it with you. So I do hope you found this helpful, and let me know how we can help. Have a great day.